A while back, I did a video on Starliner. I made two major points. The first is that Starliner delays are partly the fault of Boeing and partly beyond their control. The second was that the commercial crew contract was deliberately structured to give Boeing a big incentive to finish development and start flying flights, and that there are at least 2 billion reasons why they have kept the program going for so long. Before we get into the current state of Starliner and what the future of Starliner might look like, I have some information I need to share. My finances are tight. I can barely afford the Coke Zero and pork rinds that keep me going, much less the fresh chicharrones that I prefer. Recent responses have been less than I have hoped for, so I propose a simple agreement. I'll promise to keep making videos, and you promise to keep doing your part. I think that's a win for both of us. And if you choose not to, I'm not responsible for what might happen.
Liftoff from Cape Canaveral Air Station of the Air Force Delta II launch vehicle carrying the new GPS-2R satellite. We have had an anomaly. We just had an anomaly of the Delta II launch vehicle from Cape Canaveral Air Station. We need to secure the area. Once again, we had liftoff of Delta II launch vehicle from Cape Canaveral Air Station, and we just had a problem with the vehicle on.
Thank you for your attention to that important announcement. We now return you to your original video, already in progress. This past summer, we finally saw a crew climb into a Starliner capsule on top of an Atlas V, launch into orbit, and dock with the International Space Station. That was great. What wasn't great is that Boeing has clearly not fixed the issues that they had run into on earlier Starliner flights, with helium leaks and thruster failures. Those problems put Starliner in the doghouse. And the problem was with a section of the service module known as the Doghouse. There are 4 doghouses spaced evenly around the service module, and they are jam-packed with what is technically known as thruster stuff. Why is this such a problem? It's due to a choice made by the Starliner designers. To better understand that, it's useful to compare the 2 commercial crew capsules. Both have an upper capsule part and a lower non-capsule part. The SpaceX non-capsule part is named the trunk, and by analogy with a car, it's a place that you can carry extra stuff that you can't put in the passenger compartment. For cargo Dragon flights, it often carries large cargo that can tolerate the vacuum of space, such as these roll-out solar cell arrays. It's also a nice big surface to put solar cells to power the capsule. For crewed flights, the trunk modifies the aerodynamics of the capsule so that it remains aerodynamically stable during abort scenarios, with the pointy end forward. SpaceX chose to make the trunk simple because the trunk burns up on re-entry and all the expensive stuff returns with the capsule to be reused. Starliner follows the design choices made with Apollo and Orion, with a complicated service module. That service module contains propellant tanks, abort thrusters, reaction control thrusters, and a whole lot of plumbing and valves to control them all. That choice makes it easier to design the capsule part, because it shifts a lot of mass to the service module, and therefore the capsule and heat shield can be smaller and lighter. But it has a significant disadvantage, one that came back to bite Boeing. With the Dragon design, all of the important parts come back for analysis and inspection. SpaceX has had a couple of issues with thrusters on Dragon, but has had the luxury of looking at the thrusters after the flight to identify the problem. Most of the Starliner issues after the first flight have been thruster issues in the service module, and since the entire service module burns up on re-entry, there's no way to do post-flight analysis. That is why NASA kept delaying a Starliner decision for so long. They wanted to give Boeing every chance to gather more data from the misbehaving systems. The situation is complicated by the fact that while Boeing is in charge of Starliner, the service module propulsion system is built by Aerojet Rocketdyne. Aerojet Rocketdyne supplies 20 orbital maneuvering engines, 28 reaction control engines, and 4 launch abort engines for every service module. In addition, they also supply 160 valves, 18 tanks, and 500 feet of ducts, lines, and tubing. Because there are two companies involved, the problems in Starliner have led to a lot of finger pointing between them. NASA ultimately decided to send Starliner home without a crew on board, and the capsule landed successfully. I've complained in the past that NASA has grown far too risk-averse and pointed people to Rand Simberg's excellent ebook, Safe is Not an Option. But in this case, NASA made the right call. Many people have asked the question whether Dragon was safer than Starliner, and the reality is that Dragon has significant flight heritage and Starliner does not, and by definition that makes Dragon safer even if Starliner was behaving perfectly. It's the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is whether Starliner is operating as designed, and the answer to that question is a clear no. NASA made the right call. You simply do not put crew on a vehicle that is misbehaving unless you are really, really sure that you understand what is going on. That clearly wasn't the case here. The point of margins and redundancy in systems is to help you out when something unexpected happens, not to make it okay to fly when you know there are problems. In the post-mortem video, I was somewhat optimistic that Starliner might be successful. I no longer have that optimism. The crew flight test was the third orbital flight of Starliner, and Boeing had 25 months to make it as perfect as they could, and they ended up with 5 helium leaks and 5 thrusters that were degraded enough the software marked them as failed. I think that's a pretty good sign that there is a significant problem. There's a good analysis of the thruster doghouse from a few months ago that asserts that the underlying problem is the thruster doghouse overheats because the thermal analysis was done incorrectly. I put a link to it in the video description. I'm very much not a thermal engineer, but putting 11 thrusters, along with a bunch of valves and other plumbing, inside a sealed box seems like a poor choice from a thermal perspective. This is also an atypical design. If we look at the Orion service module, we see that none of the thruster bells are inside the service module. Dragon does put thrusters inside the capsule, but the RCS thrusters are in groups of 3, and they're spread out. The high-power thrusters are under the front cover of the capsule, and are also spread out. It seems likely that the doghouse design is flawed with issues that didn't get caught during design review, and testing did not adequately simulate the conditions in orbit. It's not clear what might be required to fix it, but it's going to be a big job, and it's going to take a lot of work and retesting. Given that background, what does the future hold for Starliner? The first question is whether the crew flight test leads to certification of Starliner by NASA. I pulled up the Boeing contract and found this. An operational readiness review occurs upon successful completion of the crewed test flight to the International Space Station. The obvious question is whether carrying crew up, but not down, counts as successful completion of the crewed test flight. I did a bit of searching and could not find a definition for successful completion. If the flight does count as successful completion, there are a few relevant requirements to achieve the Operational Readiness Review milestone before operational flights could start. Section D requires closing all the action items from previous reviews. Section F would seem to require that Boeing figure out what has been going on with the thruster failures and helium leaks, and provide evidence that is good enough for NASA to accept. Section J is about the risk assessment that is required to meet the 1 in 270 loss of crew probability required by the commercial crew contract. The crewed flight test was hoped to be a demonstration of F, that the failures and anomalies from the uncrewed test flight had all been resolved. But instead, it turned out worse than the previous flights. In a great example of how procrastination can work for you, NASA released a commercial crew plan update on October 15th as I was writing this section. NASA has decided that both 2025 crew flights will be flown on Crew Dragon, with one flight in February and one in July. Crew 10 was already known, and Crew 11 is not really a surprise, given what happened on the last Starliner flight. NASA also talked about the future of Starliner. The timing and configuration of Starliner's next flight will be determined once a better understanding of Boeing's path to system certification is established. This determination will include considerations for incorporating crew flight test lessons learned, approvals of final flight certification products, and operational readiness. They also say, meanwhile, NASA is keeping options on the table for how best to achieve system certification, including windows of opportunity for a potential Starliner flight in 2025. Since NASA has already awarded both 2025 operational flights to SpaceX, any Starliner flight in 2025 would be a repeat certification flight. But the options on the table part seems to indicate that there might be a world in which Starliner could be certified without a fourth test flight. What happens next is up to Boeing. I think there are 3 scenarios to consider. The best case is that Starliner can certify without a reflight. Their first chance to fly an operational flight would be early 2026, which puts off the revenue they want for at least another year, though there is likely a certification completion payment. It also means they have 4 years to get in 6 operational flights before ISS is deorbited. They may not be able to fly all those, which would cut down their potential revenue, though ISS might be extended beyond 2030. The second is that Boeing figures out what is causing the issues, implements a fix, and reflies the crew test flight in 2025. This is roughly the same from a program perspective, except that it requires a new service module, and may be using one of the operational Atlas Vs for a test flight. The third is that the Doghouse needs a redesign to fix the issue. This is the worst case, requiring a time-consuming redesign and almost assuredly another test flight, plus a significant amount of work to prove to NASA that the new design will do what it is supposed to do. I generally make it a rule to avoid guessing about what will happen in cases like this, because it depends both on how NASA views things and how Boeing views things, and we really don't have much data about either. And it's clear that Boeing has far bigger issues elsewhere, and that Starliner will not make or break the company. I've decided to make an exception in this case, with the caveat that my opinion is just a poorly justified guess. The question is whether Boeing will continue to fund the Starliner program, or whether they have had enough, 40% that Boeing stays in the program if they have a clear path to operational approval. Note that that's a clear path, which means understanding what is going on, knowing what to do about it, and having a solid schedule. 15% if Boeing needs to refly a crew flight test. They really want that operational money, but so far throwing money at this program has not been a recipe for success. If their fix isn't good, they could be in the same situation and a few $100 million poorer. 5% if the Doghouse needs a redesign. I think that puts the next flight at least 2 years out and bumps operational flights closer to the end of ISS. My best guess is that Boeing is going to throw in the towel, but it will obviously depend on what the path to certification is. Is it possible for Boeing to just walk away? Commercial crew is heavy on the carrot in that the operational flights can be quite lucrative, and from what I can tell, it's also light on the stick. I've read the contract, and I don't see any penalties for just walking away. Boeing has so far been motivated by the prospect of that sweet NASA money, and by wanting to keep their reputation intact. But commercial crew is only a sideshow when it comes to factors affecting their reputation and money to be made, and I would not be surprised if they decide to just walk away. And that's the current state of Starliner. If you like this video, please send somebody a Starliner bear. I promise it will have no helium leaks or thruster issues. Teller's Tachyon Tablets is a proud sponsor of Eager Space. Worn out after a long day of asteroid mining? Frazzled by FTL fatigue? Step up today to Teller's Tachyon Tablets, the premium hyperspatial restorative. Eager Space.